On July 17, 1996, TWA Flight 800 exploded over the Atlantic Ocean just 12 minutes after takeoff from New York, killing all 230 people on board. The tragedy made international headlines and sparked one of the most extensive aviation investigations in history. But here's what most people don't realize. By the time that Boeing 747 fell from the sky, Transworld Airlines was already dying. The explosion didn't kill TWA. It just delivered the final blow to an airline that had been bleeding out for decades. This is the story of how one of America's most glamorous airlines went from flying Hollywood stars across the Atlantic to filing for bankruptcy. And it involves a reclusive billionaire who refused to let go, a ruthless corporate raider who stripped it for parts, and a mysterious disaster that sealed its fate forever. Before we continue into the fall of one of America's most glamorous airlines, subscribe for real stories about corporate collapse and dark side of American history. To understand what killed TWA, you need to understand Howard Hughes because his fingerprints were all over this airline's DNA, even decades after he left. Hughes acquired control of TWA back in 1939, and at first, it seemed like a perfect match. The guy was obsessed with aviation, he understood aircraft design better than most engineers, and he had enough money to turn TWA into something special. And for a while, that's exactly what happened. Hughes pushed TWA to buy the Lockheed Constellation, a gorgeous plane that could fly coast to coast without stopping, which was revolutionary for the 1940s. He insisted on leather seats, gourmet meals, and attentive service. TWA became the airline that celebrities and business executives wanted to fly. If you were somebody important going somewhere important, you flew TWA. But here's the thing about Howard Hughes that would eventually poison everything he touched. He was a perfectionist to the point of paralysis, and he absolutely refused to delegate control to anyone. By the 1950s, Hughes was making every single decision for TWA from his hotel room, sometimes disappearing for days without answering phone calls from his own executives. The airline needed new jets to compete with rivals, but Hughes kept delaying the purchase because he couldn't decide which planes to buy. Meanwhile, American Airlines and Pan Am were already flying passengers on modern jetliners, stealing TWA's best customers. TWA's board of directors finally had enough in 1960 and sued Hughes to remove him from control. They won, but the damage was already done. The airline had fallen behind its competitors, racked up massive debt buying planes it should have purchased years earlier, and developed a corporate culture where nobody could make decisions without approval from the top. Hughes had turned TWA into an extension of his own neurotic personality, and even after he was gone, the airline never fully recovered from that DNA. The 1960s and 70s brought TWA some good years, but they also brought something that would eventually destroy the entire airline industry as it existed: deregulation. Before 1978, the government controlled which airlines could fly which routes and how much they could charge. It was basically a protected monopoly system where airlines competed on service, not price. TWA thrived in that world because they offered premium service at government-approved prices, but when President Carter signed the Airline Deregulation Act in 1978, everything changed overnight. Suddenly, new airlines could start up and fly anywhere they wanted, charging whatever prices they could get away with. The result was chaos. Low-cost carriers started undercutting the legacy airlines on price, and passengers stopped caring about gourmet meals and leather seats when they could save $200 flying a discount carrier instead. TWA tried to adapt, but they were built for the old world. They had expensive labor contracts. With their unions, they operated expensive hub airports, and they still maintained the premium service model that passengers no longer wanted to pay for. By the early 1980s, TWA was hemorrhaging money. They laid off thousands of employees, cut routes, and sold off profitable assets just to stay afloat. The airline that once symbolized luxury travel was now begging for survival, and that's when Carl Icahn showed up. If you're following the story so far, make sure you're subscribed for more true business and history deep dives. Carl Icahn was a Wall Street financier who specialized in hostile takeovers, and in 1985, he saw TWA as the perfect target. The airline's stock was trading below the value of its assets, which meant Icahn could buy the whole company, sell off the profitable parts, and make millions even if the airline itself died. That's exactly what he did. Icahn launched a hostile takeover bid, and by 1986, he controlled TWA. His plan was simple and brutal. He sold off TWA's most valuable routes to other airlines, pocketed the cash, and loaded the remaining company with debt. He sold the airline's computerized reservation system, which was generating steady profits, to a competitor. He even charged TWA rent to use planes that TWA technically owned, but Icahn had transferred to a holding company he controlled. The employees watched in horror as Icahn systematically stripped their airline for parts. The pilots' union went on strike in 1986, which gave Icahn the excuse to hire replacement workers at lower wages. The flight attendants and mechanics saw their benefits slashed. Meanwhile, Icahn was paying himself management fees and collecting dividends even as TWA spiraled deeper into debt. Here's the most infuriating part about the whole thing. Icahn wasn't trying to run an airline, he was trying to extract value from one, and that's a completely different game. When you're trying to extract value, you cut maintenance costs, you delay aircraft. Purchases, you squeeze every department until there's nothing left to squeeze. An airline run this way can survive for a while on momentum and reputation, but eventually, the decay becomes obvious to everyone. By the early 1990s, TWA was a shell of its former self. The planes were old, the service was terrible, and the employees were demoralized. Passengers started avoiding TWA when they had other options because flying TWA felt like flying a failing airline, which it was. Icahn had extracted hundreds of millions of dollars in value, but he'd also guaranteed that TWA would never recover. In 1992, TWA filed for bankruptcy, and Icahn was forced to give up control, but the damage was permanent. TWA emerged from bankruptcy in 1993, but it was barely surviving. The airline was operating with outdated planes, minimal cash reserves, and a damaged reputation. They needed time to rebuild, but time was the one thing they didn't have. On July 17, 1996, TWA Flight 800 took off from JFK, airport heading for Paris. 12 minutes into the flight, the center fuel tank exploded, tearing the Boeing 747 apart in midair. All 230 people on board died instantly. The wreckage fell into the Atlantic Ocean off Long Island, and within hours, every major news network in the world was covering the disaster. The investigation took over 4 years and cost more than $40 million, making it the most expensive aviation investigation in history. The National Transportation Safety Board eventually concluded that a spark had ignited fuel vapors in the center tank, causing the explosion. But for TWA, the cause didn't matter as much as the consequences. The crash destroyed whatever confidence passengers still had in TWA. People started avoiding the airline out of fear, even though statistically, flying was still incredibly safe. Bookings plummeted, and TWA couldn't afford to lose any more customers. The airline tried to recover by emphasizing safety improvements and launching marketing campaigns, but the stigma was too powerful. Every time someone thought about booking a TWA flight, they remembered the images of wreckage floating in the ocean. TWA limped along for another 5 years after Flight 800, but it was really just a slow-motion collapse. In 2001, American Airlines bought what was left of TWA for about $1.5 billion, which sounds like a lot until you realize that TWA had once been worth tens of billions at its peak. American immediately began retiring the TWA name, and by December 2001, Trans World Airlines officially ceased to exist. So what really killed TWA? It wasn't just one thing. Howard Hughes had built an airline that couldn't function without his obsessive control, and when he left, TWA never developed the management structure it needed to compete. Deregulation exposed TWA's weaknesses and destroyed the business model that had made it successful. Carl Icahn then stripped away everything valuable and left behind a company that could barely function. And Flight 800 delivered the final blow by destroying passenger confidence at exactly the moment when TWA needed it most. The tragedy of TWA is that all of these failures were preventable. If Hughes had built a functional management team, if TWA had adapted faster to deregulation, if Icahn had tried to run an airline instead of looting one, then maybe Flight 800 would have been just another aviation accident that the airline recovered from. Instead, it became the final chapter in the death of one of America's most iconic airlines, killed not by a single disaster, but by decades of mismanagement, greed, and decay. For more real stories about iconic companies and how they disappeared, subscribe to the channel.